The youngest in a family of high achievers, Leo was the perpetual shadow, the one most easily overlooked. Words like timid, withdrawn, and unremarkable had clung to him since birth, a shroud woven from the brilliance of his older siblings. The single most audacious act of his life had been to corner Adrian, then a struggling artist, and compel him into a partnership contract when he was at his lowest. In the 4 years that followed, a slow drip of emotional neglect had taught him a lesson he refused to accept. Adrian didn't love him. It was a stubbornness he reserved for this one thing, clinging to the pain rather than letting go. Then, the sickness began its quiet theft, eating away at his memories until he forgot how he and Adrian had even met. Forgot the younger man with the hearing aid who had once looked at him with such fierce possessiveness and made him promise to love him forever. "You didn't wear your ring today." Adrian's voice, cool and remote, was the first sound to break the silence at the dinner table. Leo flinched, his gaze falling to his own hand. A faint, pale band of skin marked the spot where the ring used to be, but the metal itself was gone. He must have taken it off while washing vegetables and forgotten to put it back on. His thumb instinctively moved to twist the absent band, finding only the soft warmth of his own skin. He mumbled that he would go get it and started to rise from his chair, intending to head for the kitchen. Adrian told him to forget it, that it wasn't important. He lowered his eyes and returned to his meal. Leo froze mid-motion. The words echoed with a brutal finality, dredging up a torrent of unwelcome history. The matching rings he had spent 43 days designing were now categorized as unimportant. His eyes flickered to Adrian's hand. A completely different ring sat on his finger, something sleek and unfamiliar. Adrian stated that he had fulfilled their agreed-upon 5 days for the month. He added that he wouldn't be back, as Caleb would be upset. Leo turned his head away, a familiar resistance tightening his chest. He said he needed to find his ring first. Adrian offered no further comment, simply watching him with an impassive expression, the kind of detachment one might reserve for a poorly staged play. The look was a silent question, asking if he was finished with the theatrics yet. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. The day he had presented the 2 rings to Adrian like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat. Adrian hadn't been so glacial back then. Though he'd feigned composure, the tips of his ears had flushed a deep crimson. As Leo slid the ring onto his finger, he had seen the subtle tremor in Adrian's hand. He had believed then that Adrian felt something for him too. Why else would he, a man pursued by the city's most brilliant and beautiful, choose Leo, who lived his life tucked away in the shadows? It was only later that he learned the truth. It had all been a misunderstanding. Adrian's affection had been intended for someone else entirely. The strength drained from his shoulders. Suddenly, the whole charade felt pointless. He sank back into his chair in silence and began to eat. After he finished, Adrian, who had only picked at his food, put down his fork with a flicker of irritation and announced he was leaving. Leo reminded him that the day wasn't over yet. When Adrian looked at him with confusion, Leo sighed and asked if Adrian would accompany him to the hospital in the afternoon. Ever since Leo had used leverage to secure their partnership contract, their relationship had deteriorated. In the beginning, Adrian had still made conversation, but that had dwindled until all that remained were his weary glances. Their connection, forcibly maintained by Leo's desperate grip, was a fragile thread. The thorns of their arrangement had been embedded in his flesh for so long, he could no longer distinguish the physical ache from the emotional one Adrian inflicted. Both, however, were proof that he was still alive. It had been a long time since he'd made any attempt to detain Adrian. Adrian paused, his brow furrowing slightly. He asked what was wrong with him. He sat back down, his eyes narrowed with a hint of suspicion as he studied Leo's face. Leo explained nonchalantly that he'd been having sharp pains in his head. It was more than that, though. He was becoming forgetful, misplacing things only to remember hours later where he'd put them. Sometimes he'd forget what he could and couldn't eat, only to be sick after a meal. The episodes were growing more frequent, more severe. He needed to get it checked out. After a moment of silence, Adrian agreed to take him. Leo thanked him with a small, placid smile. The voice was level, a stark contrast to the hysterical person he used to be. Adrian looked away, his jaw tight, and mumbled an affirmative. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the sharp lines of his profile. He was still beautiful. Adrian then asked if Leo had told his family about this. Leo shook his head, saying there was nothing to tell. Adrian remarked that they did care about him, that there was no rift between family that couldn't be mended. A faint smile touched his lips, and Leo knew exactly who he was thinking of. A person's eyes shine differently when they think of someone they love. Caleb, his brother, the adopted son. Their mother's love, which had never found its way to Leo, had been lavished upon Caleb in abundance. Leo watched him, and for the first time he didn't argue. Adrian drove him to the hospital. As Leo reached for the passenger side door, Adrian stopped him, telling him to sit in the back. A small, laminated card was tucked into the passenger side sun visor. It read, "Caleb's seat." Leo understood. Still, a hot shame burned across his face. He was the one in a binding contract with Adrian, yet in that moment he felt like the outsider, the third wheel. The violent surge of emotion sent a spike of pain through his skull. Something twisted inside his brain, a feeling of separation and confusion. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead and the world tilted violently. He reached out, trying to steady himself against the car, but Adrian's expression hardened. He knocked Leo's hand away. His voice was sharp. He demanded to know if Leo was incapable of understanding a simple instruction, telling him again to get in the back. Without the support, Leo stumbled, nearly falling to the pavement. Only then did Adrian seem to register that something was truly wrong. He took a half step forward as if to help, then froze, pulling back into himself. He remained where he was, a passive observer. He asked if Leo was all right. It was a question asked by someone who already knew the answer. The young man who once would have fussed over a scraped knuckle now stood by, impassive. Time had certainly changed them. Leo gritted his teeth against the pain and shook his head, assuring him he was fine. He opened the rear door and got in by himself. Something felt as if it were slipping away, dissolving into fog. He tried to grasp it, but the thought wouldn't form. The drive was smooth and silent. Adrian glanced at him in the rearview mirror several times, his mouth half open as if to speak, but he said nothing. Leo stared out the window at the blur of the city. Suddenly, the car pulled over to the side of the road. Adrian's voice, now infused with a warmth and tenderness Leo hadn't heard in years, filled the car. He was speaking to Caleb. His tone escalated with alarm as he asked what had happened. If it was serious, how Caleb could have been so careless. He promised he was on his way and told him not to move. His eyes met Leo's in the mirror. The apology was already there, mixed with indecision. Leo remained silent, then sighed. He should have just gotten a rideshare. He didn't move, though. He just watched Adrian, waiting to be told to leave. It was a masochistic impulse, born of resentment or desperation, he wasn't sure which. Adrian apologized. He explained that something had happened with Caleb and that he had to go. He told Leo to get a ride and that he would pick him up after the appointment. His expression was a complicated mix, as if he expected an argument. He turned slightly in his seat, adopting a placating tone. Leo simply nodded and got out of the car without another word. Adrian seemed stunned by his easy compliance. He opened his mouth, his eyes flashing with something unreadable, then closed it. He made another promise to pick him up after the checkup. His head throbbed. Leo ignored him, pulling out his phone to order a car. The street was quiet. It would probably take a while. Adrian seemed to want to say more, but after a moment of hesitation, he said nothing and drove away. A tearing pain dragged him back to consciousness. He gasped, his eyes flying open. The remnants of a chaotic nightmare clung to him as he wiped the sweat from his brow. He heard a doctor's voice nearby, explaining that there was no major damage, but that he needed to avoid significant emotional distress. He squinted toward the doorway. A tall, slender young man was leaning forward slightly, listening intently to the doctor's instructions. He had a mop of dark, unruly hair and striking eyes that seemed to absorb every word. A hearing aid was nestled behind one ear. He looked young, maybe a high school student. His clothes were faded from countless washes but impeccably clean, suggesting a modest background but a diligent approach to life. And his face. It was a face Leo liked very much. The young man said he understood and thanked the doctor. He turned and his eyes met Leo's. A flicker of delight lit up his features, and he hurried to the bedside, asking if he was awake. Oh, he remembered now. He had collapsed in the street for some reason. He tried to recall the details, but they remained elusive. He gave up. The last thing he remembered was this young man's face. He must have been the one who brought him to the hospital. A good Samaritan. Leo gratefully took his hand. The young man startled, a faint blush spreading across his fair skin. He stammered that he was just passing by and told Leo not to worry, that the bill had been paid. Leo thanked him and introduced himself, offering to add him on a social media app to transfer the money. The boy bit his lip, trying subtly to pull his hand free, but Leo's grip was firm. He looked up and met Leo's earnest gaze, then quickly looked down again. His voice was tight, and his long lashes trembled like the wings of a butterfly. He seemed terribly flustered. He apologized and asked him to speak more slowly, as he couldn't hear very well. He pointed to the hearing aid behind his ear. That he would apologize to Leo caught him by surprise. Leo chuckled, shaking his head and telling him it was no problem. He slowed his speech, pointing to his phone and repeating his offer. The boy sounded out his name, enunciating each syllable carefully. Leo. Then his eyes curved into a smile, and in a clear, pleasant voice, he introduced himself as Julian. He insisted that the money wasn't necessary. He said that Leo had looked unhappy, and he hoped he could be happy now. Julian offered this unexpected blessing to a complete stranger with utter sincerity. For some reason, Leo's eyes grew hot, and a tear traced a path down his cheek. As Julian watched in alarm, Leo remained expressionless while tears streamed from his eyes. He whispered that it was nothing, that he would be fine in a moment. Julian didn't speak. He simply handed him a tissue and sat with him in the quiet. Leo had always been the invisible child. In his youth, he had tried to earn his family's attention. He studied relentlessly, once bringing home a test that was only 5 points shy of a perfect score. The teacher required a parent's signature. His mother had given it a cursory glance before remarking that his brother and sister always got perfect scores. She had said that signing her name to his paper was an embarrassment and told him to have the housekeeper sign it instead. He had tried running away, too, hiding just 1 block over, at the entrance to a neighbor's driveway. He was sure they would find him if they just looked around the block. But they never came. When he finally slunk home that night, disheveled and hungry, they were all in the dining room, enjoying a cheerful meal together. No one even looked up. Worse than being disliked was being disregarded. The most devastating part was that he never understood why they all seemed to loathe him so. He didn't know if it was his plain appearance or his intellect, which paled in comparison to his siblings. He thought that if he just tried hard enough, one day he would earn their approval, their love. Then Caleb arrived. He was adopted. His parents, his brother, and his sister had all welcomed him, spending weeks poring over dictionaries and consulting experts to choose the perfect name for him. Caleb. Leo's name. He had once assumed it had been chosen with similar care. But that day, as they celebrated Caleb's new name, his mother had used his own as a cautionary tale. She'd said she disliked him from the moment she knew she was pregnant, and that if it hadn't been a risk to her own health, she would have terminated the pregnancy. Bringing him into the world had nearly killed her. His name had taken them less than a minute to decide on. Leo. Just Leo. An afterthought. He had run back to his small room, burying his face in his hands to muffle his sobs. No one had ever cared if he was happy. Not until this boy, Julian, told him that he hoped he would be. That simple wish had been absent from his life for 26 years. The hospital determined it was a somatic symptom of psychological trauma. His body had enacted a self-defense mechanism in response to an overwhelming shock. They couldn't say if or when his memories might return. Leo listened with a detached air, feeling surprisingly fine. He probed his own mind and found that, aside from a few distinct gaps, most of his life was still there. The missing pieces didn't seem to affect his ability to function. He glanced at Julian, who was diligently listening to the doctor and scribbling notes in a small journal. The doctor chuckled, teasing Leo that this young man seemed more concerned about his health than he was. Leo lowered his head, knowing it was true. Julian mumbled bashfully that Leo was delicate, so he would remember the instructions for him. Leo, all 6 feet of him, wasn't exactly a hard-edged tough guy, but he didn't think he qualified as delicate. The doctor, seeming to understand, said no more. He prescribed some medication and, seeing that Leo was physically stable, cleared him for discharge. Julian asked if he was going home. They walked out of the hospital together. Leo nodded, pulling out his phone to search for nearby hotels. He said he probably was, but he couldn't remember where he lived. He had a strong, instinctual feeling that he shouldn't go back to his family's house. The constant stress of being there would probably regress his memory back to elementary school within a week. He repeated his offer to pay Julian back for the hospital bill, insisting he couldn't let a $400 debt go unpaid and damage the kindness of a stranger. Julian pressed his lips together stubbornly and walked ahead. With his long legs, he quickly outpaced Leo, who had to hurry to catch up, grabbing the corner of his shirt. "Julian!" He stopped. When he looked down at Leo, his lashes drooped pitifully, like a large dog being scolded. Leo rubbed his temples in frustration and explained that he really needed to pay him back. Julian pointed to his ear, a look of pure incomprehension on his face. Leo looked closer. The hearing aid was gone. Julian stated, with a hint of defiance, that he had manually turned off his reception. He couldn't hear. Leo was speechless. "Leo!" A voice, both familiar and strange, sounded nearby. He frowned and turned to see 2 men. One he recognized. The other was a stranger. The one he knew was his brother, Caleb, the source of so much of his childhood misery. Though looking at him now, he found the memories were hazy, their sharp edges blurred, which seemed to lessen the pain associated with them. The other man was handsome, with a dark, brooding expression. The moment Leo saw him, a tangible, physical ache seized his heart. It was bizarre. Why did the sight of these 2 men instantly make him miserable? Seeing that they had spotted him, Leo feigned ignorance with a clumsy performance, turning his back and grabbing Julian's hand, attempting a quick escape. Caleb called out his name, demanding to know where he was going. The dark-faced man strode forward, blocking their path. Julian, sensing trouble, put his hearing aid back in and moved to stand protectively in front of Leo. The man's hostile gaze raked over Julian. He asked who he was, his voice laced with contempt. He said, his words clipped and sharp, that Leo had a deaf person accompany him to a doctor's appointment. He sneered, asking if the doctor had to use sign language to accommodate him. Before the last word left his mouth, Leo's hand had already moved. The sharp crack of a slap silenced the surrounding area. He flexed his stinging fingers, a strange and unsettling sense of satisfaction washing over him. He shot a cold look at Caleb, his voice flat and emotionless, and warned him that if he ever heard his friend utter such disrespectful words again, he would strike him as well. With that, he took Julian's hand and started to walk away. Caleb's voice was sharp with reprimand. He yelled that Leo was insane, asking if he even realized who he had just hit. The other man stood frozen, one hand covering his cheek, his eyes wide with disbelief that Leo would dare to strike him. He shouted after him, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief, asking where he was going. The wind whipped around them, carrying his fractured cry. Leo didn't turn back. He answered that where he was going was none of his business. The man threatened that if he took one more step, he would unilaterally terminate their contract. Leo finally stopped. He turned to face the man, who looked nearly hysterical, and a wave of profound disappointment washed over him. He agreed, telling him it was exactly what he wanted and that they had a deal. Then, he led Julian away from the hospital without a backward glance. On the street, Leo noticed the deep red of Julian's earlobes and belatedly released his hand, apologizing. Julian assured him it was fine. He reached out and gently ruffled Leo's hair, the warm touch a surprising comfort. Then he opened his arms, suggesting that Leo looked like he needed a hug, and that he could offer one. Leo turned away, fighting down the bitterness in his throat. He told Julian not to be so kind to him, whispering that he wasn't a good person and didn't deserve it. Leo was the shadow at his family's feet, the bad omen who spoiled their perfect picture. A piece of paper was pressed into his hand. It was the page from Julian's journal, filled with the doctor's instructions. Julian had added a note at the bottom. It said that Leo was good, and that he should live for himself and take care. And then he was gone. No demand for money, no exchange of contact information. Leo watched his retreating figure, the paper in his hand feeling impossibly warm. He pressed it against his chest, right over his heart, and the warmth became a searing ache. To live for himself? He found temporary refuge at the apartment of a friend, a lawyer named David. David pushed his glasses up his nose without looking up from a legal text as thick as a brick. He asked mildly if Leo was having trouble with the one at home, adding that staying with him wasn't free. They could split the rent. Leo sank into the plush sofa, feeling exhausted. He asked what the monthly rent was. At that, David finally looked up, pointing out that he wouldn't refund the rent if Leo left early. Leo assured him he wasn't asking for a refund and added that he had no memory of the one at home. He tossed the diagnostic report onto the coffee table. David picked it up and read it carefully, his brow furrowed. After a moment, he declared that they should take care of long overdue business while Leo's mind was still clear. He went to his study and returned with a file, handing Leo the contract inside and telling him to read it carefully. 2 names were signed at the bottom, his own and a man named Adrian. The document detailed a transfer of resources and money to Adrian, with the sole condition being his love in return. The words read less like a contract and more like a sorrowful pact, the legal embodiment of a heart offered up on a platter. His fingers instinctively went to his ring finger, finding only skin. When he reached the last page, he found the one clause that brought him a sliver of relief. He could terminate the agreement at any time, with 1 week's notice provided by his lawyer. The wealth his family had allowed to slip through their fingers, though a pittance to them, was a fortune to an ordinary person. For someone who only needed one opportunity to climb into the upper echelon of society, it was more than enough. He didn't remember this person. He shook his head, his voice steady, and asked David to please take care of canceling the contract. The recording ended, followed by the soft chime of the phone. David smiled, waving the device. He reminded Leo that he himself had said it, so he couldn't blame him later if his memory returned and he changed his mind. Leo replied with a weary sigh, asking if he was really the type of person to go back on his word. David conceded that, on most things, he wasn't. He tapped the contract, adding, except when it came to him. Him? Leo shook his head again. He didn't believe it. He couldn't believe there was a person like that in his life. He knew himself. He was ordinary, unloved, and because of that, he always left himself an escape route. At the first hint of another's displeasure, he would turn and flee. Even this contract had an exit clause. How could he have loved someone so recklessly? David looked at him, his gaze seeming to see through the present Leo to the one who came before. He said that, though it might be wrong to say it, losing his memory might not be a bad thing for him. The lawyer smiled and made a toasting gesture, suggesting that it was the start of a new life. He mentioned that his son was away for the night, so they could have a drink. David informed him that the notice of termination had been delivered to Adrian, and that Adrian wanted to see him. Leo, engrossed in a book, shook his head without looking up, saying it was best not to. David agreed that there was probably nothing left to say, adding that Adrian had seemed very calm. Leo remarked that it was to be expected. From David's description, the man had never liked him. David corrected him, saying they had shared something good once a long time ago. Seeing the storytelling glint in his friend's eye, Leo quickly held up a hand to stop him. He pointed out that whatever good they had was in the past. He was sure the time they had spent tormenting each other far outweighed any happy memories. It was time for him to let go. Besides, the current version of himself had no desire to continue any kind of relationship with the man. Yet, for some reason, his heart felt hollow, as if something had been cleanly excised with a surgeon's scalpel. He could feel its absence through a thin fog, but nothing more. David just smiled. He accepted it and changed the subject, saying that since Leo was just idling at home, he had found something for him to do. Adrian had a dream. He hadn't dreamed in a very long time. He dreamt of a night illuminated by a crescent moon. He saw himself extending a hand to a boy huddled in the shadows. In that instant, time froze. The boy's ghostly image paused. It was a lucid dream. He could clearly see his younger self, his face still marked with fresh, bleeding cuts. He had come from far away, staking out the entrance to a gala, waiting for the person he loved to pass by so he could give them a single rose. It was the most beautiful one he could find, purchased with the last of his money. He had waited for hours, but the person he loved never answered his messages, never came out to meet him. Young Adrian finally gave up. He sighed, ready to leave, when he saw a boy about his age crouching nearby. It was a young Leo. His eyes were clear and bright, yet they held an inexpressible sadness, a fog of sorrow. For reasons he couldn't explain, Adrian found himself drawn to those eyes. He approached quietly. He had asked him why he wasn't home so late. Looking back now, he realized how gentle his own voice had been, as if he were afraid of startling a small animal. Young Leo had looked up, his eyes wide with surprise, but he didn't speak. He just shrank further into the shadows, his gaze fixed stubbornly on the brightly lit mansion. Adrian had crouched down beside him, asking if he'd eaten, assuring him he wasn't a bad person. He asked if he was waiting for someone to come out, too. Young Leo had whispered that it was his home. At the time, Adrian had assumed Leo had fought with his family. After a moment of hesitation, he offered him the rose. He had told him it was a beautiful flower, and that beautiful things made people happy. He had hoped it would make him happy. This is how it happened in the dream, too, wasn't it? The present-day Adrian waited coldly for the scene to play out. It was because of this flower that Leo had fallen for him, that so many complications had arisen between him and Caleb. Because it was a dream, a cruel thought entered Adrian's mind. He urged his younger self not to do it. Don't let Leo fall in love. Tear the flower to shreds, throw it away, anything but give it to Leo. Without this one complication, he and Caleb would have been together long ago. Leo was obsessive. He was plain and awkward. Adrian had told him countless times to be more like Caleb, to try harder with his family, but he was stubborn. He never listened. Adrian had tried to break up, to end the contract so many times, but Leo wouldn't hear of it. Such a stubborn person. How could he possibly get by without him? As he thought this, he suddenly found he didn't want the dream Adrian to destroy the flower. There had been, at the very least, some happy moments between them. Leo's devotion was absolute. He loved him with a fierce and unwavering heat, even when Adrian pushed him away again and again. He would always be there, watching with those clear, sincere eyes, waiting for him to return and take him away. Leo was clumsy, but his gestures were always so pure and genuine they made Adrian want to call him a fool, even as a lump formed in his throat. Without Adrian, how would Leo manage? Adrian realized, with a jolt, that there had been countless opportunities to destroy the contract, to nullify the memory of that flower. He was no longer the broke kid he used to be. So why hadn't he? His own voice from the past pulled him from his thoughts. He heard his younger self speaking the familiar lines about the beautiful flower. But before he could finish, young Leo suddenly jumped to his feet. "You're here." His voice, filled with pure joy, completely drowned out young Adrian's words. Leo threw himself into the arms of another boy, displaying an affection that should have been directed at him. His voice was like honey. The other boy, who wore a hearing aid, blushed and stammered an apology for being late. He shyly presented a carefully wrapped grilled cheese sandwich he'd been holding, explaining that his mom said it was okay, that she liked Leo, and that they should go home. Go home? Whose home? What home did Leo have besides the one with him? Adrian wanted to scream, but no words would come. He wanted to stop them, but his body was paralyzed. All he could do was stand there, watching in agony as the two figures clung to each other and walked away, their silhouettes shrinking in the distance until they dissolved like two snowflakes, drifting down to the earth. Adrian woke with a violent start. He had fallen asleep at his desk. On the polished wood surface lay the termination notice. He had spent the entire night scrutinizing it, searching for any sign of forgery. There was none. It was authentic. His throat was dry. The dream felt terrifyingly real. He shot up from his chair and strode out of his study, dialing a number as he went. He asked for Lee. The person on the other end answered with a groggy hello, complaining that he'd just gotten off a long night shift. Adrian's voice was urgent. He told him to pull the medical records for his partner. His partner? Lee asked, confused. Who? Adrian faltered. After a beat of silence, he said softly, Leo. His medical records. He massaged his temples. He hadn't expected the job to be a personal companion. David's exact words were, "If you can tolerate that guy, you've got the patience to be a companion." David owed the Vance family a favor, and since Leo owed David, he was the one sent to repay it. Besides, he was getting stir-crazy cooped up in the apartment. The Vance estate was impressive, but Mr. and Mrs. Vance were surprisingly down-to-earth, with kind faces and gentle voices. For some reason, though, Leo felt a strange sense of familiarity when he looked at them. Mrs. Vance patted his hand with a warm smile, him that her son had a temper. She said when he got angry, he was as stubborn as a mule, and that Leo should just get out of his way and call for their housekeeper, Betty, to give him a sedative if needed. Mr. Vance, who seemed to be a man of few smiles, attempted one for Leo. The result was more stiff than reassuring, which only made him more nervous. He hoped this companion job wouldn't cost him his life. Mr. Vance announced that his youngest son was home today and that he would have him come down for an introduction. A staff member left to fetch him but returned moments later, whispering something in Mr. Vance's ear. Mr. Vance muttered to his wife, just loud enough for Leo to overhear, that the boy refused to come down and meet their guest. It seemed the young Mr. Vance was going to be difficult. Leo briefly considered making a run for it. Mrs. Vance just shook her head and gave the staff member new instructions. A few minutes later, he heard footsteps approaching. The door opened. Standing in the doorway was a familiar face. Julian. He was splattered with colorful paint, some of which had even made it onto his face. There were dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. He seemed just as shocked to see Leo, his eyes widening in surprise. The next second, he slammed the door shut. The sound of his retreating footsteps faded down the hall. Mr. and Mrs. Vance were speechless. Leo was speechless. Mrs. Vance forced a laugh and invited Leo to stay for lunch, explaining that it was almost ready. The next time he saw Julian was at the dining table. He must have showered and changed into clean clothes. The look of irritation was gone, replaced by a calm serenity. He walked directly to the table and, before a staff member could assist, pulled out the chair next to Leo and sat down. His unique, clean scent enveloped him. Leo smiled and whispered a quiet hello, then noticed Julian wasn't wearing his hearing aid. Julian smiled back, his eyes fixed on Leo's lips. He said that if Leo spoke slowly, he could understand. Leo mouthed his words carefully, asking if he could read lips. Julian nodded. It was good to see him again. His gentle voice immediately soothed the anxiety Leo felt in the unfamiliar surroundings, like a calm river flowing into his heart. Every time it was him. Whenever Leo was alone, Julian always seemed to appear. Still, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that he had forgotten something. Someone important. Julian accompanied him to his follow-up appointment. As they stepped outside, they saw a young man standing under a tree. It was September, and the sweet olive trees were in bloom. The city had entered its rainy season, and the ground was littered with tiny blossoms from a recent storm. Leo walked beside him, their feet crushing the petals. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, and a faint breeze carried the scent of fermented wine. Julian looked at the dark shadows under his eyes and asked how he had been feeling lately. Leo frowned. He said that perhaps because his mind was at peace, his body's defense mechanisms were fading. He had started dreaming a lot lately, dreaming of the past he had forgotten. The dreams started with his childhood and moved forward, but the faces of the people in them were always blurry and indistinct. Each dream felt like a stage play, and he was always standing in the farthest corner. Julian asked what happened next. He had dreamt of him, Leo answered without thinking. When he realized what he'd said, he saw Julian lean in close, a smile playing on his lips. His eyes crinkled at the corners as he said, very seriously, that he had heard that Leo had dreamt of him. It was the last dream. He was a child again on the night he had run away from home. He was crouching by the gate, watching everyone celebrate Caleb's birthday party inside. No one saw him. Then someone called his name. He turned and saw Julian. The young boy stood before him and held out his hand, announcing that he had come to play with him. He took his hand, and Julian led him forward, right onto the stage. The audience below was filled with people, all of them looking at him with warm, encouraging eyes. After 24 years, he had finally reached the center of his own stage. He looked at Julian and, for reasons he didn't understand, he reached up and cupped his face, gazing at him intently. Julian's eyes widened, but he didn't pull away. A slow blush crept up his neck, and his lashes fluttered as he closed his eyes. The scent of sweet olive was intoxicating. Leo stared at his soft, parted lips and began to lean in. "What the hell do you two think you're doing?" An angry roar shattered the moment. Leo startled and looked up to see a face contorted with fury. He squinted, trying to place him. Adrian. The name from his friend's story clicked into place. Adrian looked like he hadn't been sleeping either. He was thinner than when Leo had last seen him at the hospital, with a dark stubble on his chin. He was dressed too lightly for the autumn chill. His eyes were red-rimmed, his burning gaze fixed on Leo. He held out a trembling hand, and in his palm lay a ring. His voice was raw. "You win, Leo. We'll go to the doctor. We'll fix this. We can be together." Leo's gaze fell to the ring. Suddenly, his head roared. He had accepted the flower from Adrian, his heart exploding with a fragile hope. He had thought, finally, someone sees me. After meeting Adrian, his life had slowly begun to fill with color. His parents and brothers even started to notice him, occasionally asking about Adrian. He had always defended him, insisting that Adrian was a good person, a good friend. He hadn't understood Caleb's knowing, almost pitying smile back then. He learned later that it was just another one of fate's cruel jokes, with him as the punchline. But he had refused to surrender. Caleb, always weighing his options, had kept Adrian on a string with just enough affection to keep him hooked. It was during that time that Leo realized what he felt was more than friendship. He loved Adrian. In the most difficult year, when Caleb had abandoned Adrian, Leo had found him, drunk and broken, in a tiny apartment. He had reached out his hand, just as Adrian had once reached out to him when he was a lonely boy huddled by a mansion gate. Their life together had improved day by day. Adrian seemed to try genuinely to play the part of a partner. He learned how to plan surprises, how to care for him when he was sick. Once, burning with a high fever, Adrian had mumbled his name in a delirious haze, clinging to his sleeve and whispering that Leo was all he had. And Adrian was all he had. Even knowing he was Adrian's calculated choice while Adrian was his all-in bet, he had accepted it. As long as the outcome was the same, the details didn't matter. He had squeezed that hand back and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the atmosphere in the hospital room was tense. A doctor with dark circles under his eyes, a stone-faced Adrian, and Julian, sitting by his side. He wanted to close his eyes again, but the doctor noticed he was awake. The doctor chirped that his little patient was back with them. He moved gracefully around the tense standoff and stood before Leo, smiling. Leo nodded and sat up, only then realizing he was still clutching Julian's hand. The doctor looked at a scan. He explained that Leo's brain's defense mechanisms had probably collapsed all at once, which was too much for his system to handle, causing him to faint. He asked if his memory was fully restored now. Leo rubbed his temples and said softly that he wasn't sure, but he certainly remembered a lot more. Julian kept his head down, his dark hair obscuring his eyes. He didn't look at Leo. Leo tried to pull his hand back, but Julian's grip was like iron. Adrian whispered his name, asking if he remembered him. Leo met his intense gaze and nodded. Thank God, thank God. Adrian repeated the words, his voice thick with relief. He hurried to the bedside and knelt, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. He opened it to reveal a ring, one he knew intimately. He stammered that he had brought his too, and that he would never take it off again. As he spoke, his voice broke. On the ring finger of his left hand was the matching ring from the set Leo had designed. Leo was silent for a moment before he said no. Adrian's relieved smile froze. For a second, he looked as if he hadn't heard. He pressed on, saying that if Leo was worried, they could write a new contract, one that was unbreakable for a lifetime. He said they could go abroad and get married, that many countries had legalized it. Leo interrupted his frantic planning. He said that legend holds that the ring finger of the left hand contains the vena amoris, the vein of love, connecting it directly to the heart. He looked at Adrian. There was a desperate plea in his eyes, begging him to stop. Your heart isn't here, he said, so let's just let it go. Adrian's voice was a low growl. He gripped the bedsheet, his knuckles white. No, we can't just let it go. We've spent so many years together. How can we just let it go? He insisted that he hadn't been in contact with Caleb. He begged for them to start over. Start over? Leo sighed. Our beginning was a mistake. My heart isn't with you anymore. How can we possibly start over? Under the blanket, the hand holding his tightened. Julian finally looked up. His eyes, usually so soft and bright, were now filled with a fierce, unwavering possessiveness. He heard me, Leo realized. Spring, summer, fall, winter. The seasons turned. Autumn passed quickly, and winter announced itself with the first snowfall. His phone rang just as he was leaving a meeting. He saw his mother's name on the screen and felt a strange pang. Time had moved so fast since he'd left home. He caught a snowflake on his glove and, for the first time in 3 years, answered his mother's call. Her voice was tired. She asked why he hadn't been home lately. He didn't answer her question, asking instead if she needed something. She said that everyone missed him, his brothers too. She asked him to come home for the holidays. He fell silent. His eldest brother, his face now a blur in his memory, and Caleb. Did they miss him? He smiled a little, his voice gentle as he replied that he was doing well now. Then he hung up. In his 3rd year of working, he became a licensed architect and a key member of his firm. He made many interesting friends who described him as kind, meticulous, and reliable. The most impulsive thing he had ever done was probably on a whim, when he agreed to go with Julian to England, get married, and have a small wedding. "Did you wear your ring today?" Julian's voice and his umbrella appeared at the same time. After aggressive and successful treatment, his hearing was now nearly indistinguishable from anyone else's. Leo held up his hand for inspection. Of course, he answered. The great artist was always checking. Julian leaned in and pressed a soft kiss behind his ear. Leo laughed, promising he was always ready for inspection. What Leo had forgotten, Julian remembered. That grand mansion was his family's home. He had sat in his room, having locked his parents out, screaming into a world that remained utterly silent. It was useless. He was deaf. In middle school, when self-esteem is most fragile, he had refused to go to school. He felt everyone looked at him with the same pitying eyes. The doctors said it could be fixed, but he had stopped believing them. During those days when he refused to learn, he met Leo. He was a quiet boy who barely spoke. Julian thought he must be a lonely soul like himself, and that's why he noticed him. He would lock himself in his room and watch from his window, waiting for the time when Leo would emerge from the house next door and get into a car. He was cute, with round, expressive eyes that looked sad when he looked down, making you want to give him everything you own just to see him smile. He wanted to be his friend, but he could never find the chance. He began to cooperate with his treatment. Even though he couldn't hear, he practiced speaking, wanting to perfectly articulate the words. "Hello, my name is Julian. I'd like to be your friend." He finally got his chance one evening. After a treatment session, he returned to his room and instinctively looked out the window. He saw him crouching pitifully by the gate. He thought, this is it, my chance. But by the time he ran downstairs, Leo was gone. He didn't see him for days after that. Then, for the sake of his treatment, his mother moved them to a new house. He thought one day he would find him again. That obsession. He bit down gently on the young man's collarbone, sweat trickling down his chest. It had only grown stronger after he finally had him. And there were still others, lurking in the shadows, coveting Leo. He had already intercepted numerous gifts and confession letters. One, a clear loser, still had the audacity to claim how deeply in love they had once been. Leo patted his back, murmuring something with a tearful catch in his voice. "He can't hear you, baby." His hearing aid was on the nightstand. The truth was, after the surgery, his hearing was fine, but he still said it. He knew the look in his eyes was one of pure want as he stared at Leo's slightly parted lips. "Unless you say you'll love me forever. More than anyone else. You have to promise." Leo looked at him with an expression of fond exasperation. He sighed, then leaned in close to his ear, his breath warm. "I will always love Julian the most. Promise." His mind exploded, a supernova of fireworks. Noticing the change in him, Leo started laughing, despite his own flushed embarrassment. Again, Julian growled. "And this time, I won't accept any pleas for mercy." The night was still young.